All right, so for today's project, we are building a credenza that is going to hide a litter box for your cat. So one of those robotic litter boxes that automatically self-cleaning. Now this is not your normal credenza. The client asked me that I build it in Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas style. So I'm starting out building it with some rustic knotty white oak to get our theme off to the right start. All right, so even though this is a rustic piece, I'm not going to use that as an excuse to do sloppy work. So I am squaring and jointing all the edges that are going to require joinery, so that way my joinery is nice and tight and strong. I'm starting out ripping the boards for the top, and I start with the top because it's the most visible part of the project, or one of the most visible parts of the project, and I want to make sure I use some of my choice pieces for the top. A lot of the framing members can come out of the less desirable pieces because they are less prominent in the design. All right, so I planed the top boards down to thickness, so they're a little bit too smooth to pull off that rustic Nightmare Before Christmas look. So I'm sending them through the bandsaw, just kissing the edge and randomly wiggling the board back and forth and speeding up and slowing down my feed rate to create a little bit of a random resawn look to add some of the distress back in. This is mostly a standard glue up for the top. Usually when I cut my dominoes, I reference the domino on the top face of the board, so that way it ensures that the visible pieces will all line up. But since I randomly distressed the top face, I ended up referencing off the bottom face, and any kind of unevenness that I deem too uneven, I'll sand back or carve back after the glue is dried. Right, so to do the rustic theme justice, I want to make sure some of the knots in the wood ends up in the front panels of the piece. And I also want to make sure, just for strength, that I don't have big knots in the rails and stiles of the frame of the piece. So I'm just taking some time here to kind of lay out my parts and rough cut them a little oversized so that I can slowly work down to the right size as I go, making sure I get everything just right. All right, again, to make sure I have good, nice, tight, strong joinery, I'm spending a few minutes cleaning up and squaring up the edges, and then we'll re-distress them later on. And then also, I want to make sure that the corners of the cabinet look kind of like big posts or big beams. So I'm ripping a miter to miter the corners, so that way on the outside it looks like one piece, but on the inside I have room for the litter box. And as always, for good accuracy and good shot practices in general, I always use some type of stop block when cutting my pieces to length to ensure that they all are exactly the same, to help ensure the cabinet comes out square. All right, so before I get started on cutting the joinery, I'm doing a quick layout to make sure that I'm getting all the parts in the right orientation. So I cut the joinery on the right side and in the right spots of each part. All right, so on this piece, I'm going to use a combination of joinery types. Since the panels are going to be set in a groove, the mid-dividing rails, I'm just going to use a tongue and groove as well for that area. And then for the actual structure, like the top rails and the side stiles, those will all get a tongue and groove treatment, just because it makes it easier to cut it all at once, but also reinforced with a domino. All right, so there are a few spots on the front of the cabinet where the cat goes in and out, where I don't need a dado the full length of the board, just at the top area where the panels go. So I'm just set up here at the router table to do a stop dado, just dropping the piece down, carefully going across to my layout line, and then lifting the piece up. All right, and then to make sure the dado is centered on the board, I just flipped it around and lined up my layout lines again and dropped the piece down onto the dado that I just cut and ran it across just to make sure it's nice and clean and centered. All right, so I got all my dados and grooves cut, so I am cutting the corresponding tongues in the divider pieces. So I'm just doing a test piece right now just to make sure I have a nice snug fit before going through and cutting all the rest of them. Right, and as I mentioned earlier, using the domino to reinforce the main structure of the case. Before building and cutting the panels to size, I did a quick test fit on all four sides just to make sure those frames go together, and then also I could take some hard measurements for the panel sizes and then calculate a little bit for wood movement and whatnot. So creating the panels to hold true to the theme of the piece had quite a few operations involved in getting there. So I started out by cutting each panel a little bit oversized. Right, and then I studied each board to determine which side of the board I liked the best, and the side I didn't like the best, I flattened that side at the joiner to use as my reference edge, and then I edge jointed both edges so that way I could glue up the panels to the right width. All right, so when I glued up the panels, I made sure that reference edge was flat against the clamp so that way the back side was nice and flat across both pieces to create the panel. Okay, so instead of sending the panels through the thickness planer to bring them down to the right thickness, I instead resawed them at the bandsaw, varying my speed so that way I could create those erratic saw marks to distress the board. So I'd speed up, I'd slow down a little bit, I might push the board a little bit away from the fence, back and forth kind of action just to create that rough resawn texture. All right, and that did a pretty good job of creating some nice resaw marks. I'm looking at this and kind of deciding that it might be a little bit too much, that it might be resawed too evenly or all the way across the board. But I kind of want it to have a look like it was skip planed also. So to create the skip planed effect, I very carefully lowered the cutter head of the planer down to where it just barely kissed the board and then sent each of the boards through. So it kind of cleaned off some of the high spots on the board. So up to this point, they're just a little bit long and a little bit wide, so I verified my measurements and then cut each one to width and length. All right, so for this style, I decided to do a classic raised mission style panel. And because this is such a large bit, I took it in multiple passes. So I just did one shallow pass, then raised the bit, did another pass, raised the bit some more to do the final pass. And as I did each pass, I started out with the end grain and I turned it counterclockwise as I went around the panels so that way any kind of tear out got cleaned up by the next pass. And then since when you're looking into the cabinet, you can see the back panels and then there's doors that open and close on either side. I wanted to make sure the back of the panels look good too. So I did the same treatment. I did a raised panel route on the back of the panel so that way it looks great from either way you look at it. Right, and before assembly, I pre-stained and finished the panels so that way if the panel shrinks, you don't see any kind of raw wood that didn't get stained if I would have done it the other way. Now this stain is a custom stain that basically what I did is I found a really cool scene in the movie because the client wanted it a dark spooky gray, so I found kind of like this moonlit scene with this dark gray background and built a custom stain around that scene to create that dark spooky feel. All right, before my final glue up, I did a test assembly so I could glue the door together at the same time. And so I'm just doing a test fit here so I can mark my parts for the door to cut them to fit. I'm aiming for about a 16th inch reveal all the way around, and that should give us a nice operating door. And as you can see here, the door construction is also a tongue and groove situation that I also reinforced with festool dominoes. All right, and it is time to assemble the case, and I'm going to do this glue up in sub-assembly. So the first sub-assembly is the corner posts that I ripped at a 45-degree angle earlier, and I'm just going to glue those guys together, and I'm going to take a lot of care to make sure that those are glued up square. If they're out of square, the whole case is going to be out of square. All right, since there's a lot of moving parts here with the panels, the center divider stiles and rails and all of the different parts and pieces in this one panel, I'm using epoxy so that way it has a slow set to it and I can just take my time and have a stress-free glue up and make any kind of adjustments as I need. Right, and then I just worked my way around the cabinet, gluing up each door and panel as I went. All right, and then once I got all the sub panels glued together, I started gluing those sub panels to each other to create the main case. All right, so while the rest of the case is drying, I turn my attention to creating the bottom panel. The bottom panel is made from plywood mainly because I just want to be able to drop it in and not have to worry about a lot of wood movement, so I can just kind of drop it in and secure it in from below. I made it by shop sawing some veneer of the knotty oak, so that way I have that same look and theme in the bottom panel, and then just veneered it to the plywood and cut it to fit. Having a veneer bag this size where I can pretty much put a full sheet of plywood in has been a game changer for my shop. It has allowed me to defy wood movement in my builds by veneering just about anything I want to. All right, we're getting down to the last few details, and one detail that I needed to add is to put a base molding around the base of the cabinet. So I chucked up this huge, massive, butt-puckering, scary bit in the router table and just made my own base. For safety, I left it attached to a larger piece, and then once I get done routing out all my pieces, I'll just rip the molding off at the table saw. I just feel a lot safer with this big of a bit to have a big piece of wood to hang on to than thin little strips to try to route. All right, so it's time to route out a little pocket for the hinges. And this is one of the great things about Andy Klein's twin turbo vise is that the posts that operate the vise are wide enough that I can slide the entire door in between the posts and clamp it securely while I route out the little mortises for the hinges. All right, and to route out the mortises, basically I built a little plywood jig around my hinge, and then I'm just following it around with a pattern cutting bit in the router. Right, and before I remove the jig, I'm just going to use it as a reference point to reference my chisel against to square up the corners that the router bit left round. A little pre-drill action with a Vicks bit, and we'll be ready to get this installed once it's stained. All right, before we do the final staining on the frame, I have one more detail to add that the client requested, and that is to carve some curly cues. I'm not really sure what they're called. I can't remember the architectural name for them, but throughout the movie, on fence posts and on walls and on the sleigh and in plants and all kinds of things, there's these little curly cue details throughout the movie. So we're going to draw those on there and then carve them in. Right, and then because this detail was out for a lot of interpretation of what I wanted to do versus what the client envisioned, after I drew it on there, I took a picture of it to send it out to the client so I could get her approval on it to make sure she liked the direction of what I was going and that I understood her description of what she wanted. All right, and then once I got her approval, I started carving, and basically I just traced my Sharpie mark around, and we're going just deep enough to create a little bit of a reveal in there. So it's a subtle carving, but it'll still stand out once the finish is on there. All right, and then to do the carving, I'm just using a handheld die grinder on a flexible shaft. It's basically just a cheap one from Amazon. I know there's some really expensive, nice ones out there, but this thing worked great, and I couldn't really tell you what the difference is between the really expensive one. And not to throw a bitter a thought out there, but I've been buying a lot of high-end tools, and the high-end tools just don't last. So I bought this thing thinking I could buy six of them for the price of the high-end one if it burns up quick. And so far, it's working great. I found while I was carving, it helped a lot to set up a raking light to kind of cast a little bit of a shadow across the carving detail to see where I've been and where I needed to go. All right, and then the final detail the client asked for was to deliberately cut some notches in the wood to make it look like there was some deliberate tear out, that it was worn and been a little bit abused, just to keep up with the theme of the spooky Nightmare Before Christmas. All right, and now time to put the final coat of finish on. So I'm starting out with a stain coat, and this is one of the downsides of pre-staining your panels. If you don't want to get it too messed up or overlapped with the stain that you're putting on now, you got to mask them off. So it didn't take too long, maybe an hour to mask all that off, but I think it's still well worth it to do so. And then once I got the stain on there, I took it into the spray booth and sprayed it with conversion varnish and photographed it and sent those photos off to the client to schedule a delivery. All right, and that's the final piece. Thanks for watching.